Ever since the Ukraine crisis, people have been asking me what the chances are that this war escalates into something bigger. The world's been stuck in a fever pitch of worrying if the war to end all wars will happen in our time. This video will be a breakdown on my part of what are the chances that we could get the next world war. If a war were to break out as well, how bad would it get? The answers may unalterably change our lives. Hi, I'm Rudyard, the guy behind What If Alt Hist, and one thing that doesn't change is our need for comfort and space, and practical use that we've always had. That's why this video is sponsored by Extra, the world's largest smart wallet company. Extra provides wallets that makes accessing your cash and cards easy, and take up as little space as possible on your person. Extra wallets are stylish and comfortable, easily fitting with any outfit without being cumbersome like old leather wallets. I mean, they have these really cool functions where you just press a button and the cards just come out. Or you have other kinds where it's basically just a push out and it's a single tab. On top of that, Extra wallets feature a solar-powered tracking device that you can access from your phone when you download the app, so you can find your wallet anywhere in the world, ensuring that you're always aware of what's going on with your personal items. Just 2 hours of sunlight can power your tracking device for months, meaning this is an extremely durable purchase. Extra wallets are fantastic for anyone, and I highly recommend these products, which are stylish, functional, and secure. Now for my viewers, Extra is offering a 20% off cut for anyone who clicks the links in the description. So check out Extra so you can get a wallet you can rely on. Given that this is a politics and history channel, I've covered the potential for future wars in great detail in other videos. I'm just going to briefly summarize the factors I've talked about before here to create a picture of what could be driving the world towards war. The best way to describe it is that the world is in a constant struggle between the world as it really exists and the institutions humans make to manage it. The problem we run into is that the institutions we use to manage our world were largely created at the end of World War II, while the world we live in has changed a tremendous amount since then. Wars are natural to human history and the world order. You can repress them and the necessary changes to the world order that come with them, but they have to come out at some point. The easiest trend to look at, and the one I've talked about the most ad nauseum before on this show, but only since it's the most pertinent factor in world today, is that due to globalization, we're seeing a remarkable amount of competition over the world order that's gradually breaking it. There's a reason that there are riots and dissatisfaction in France, India, China, America, or Canada now. The underlying world system isn't working for anyone anymore. The shortest explanation is that American or French workers are being undercut by Bulgarians and Mexicans, who in turn are undercut by Chinese, who are undercut by Indonesians and Bangladeshis. The world's population has exploded by a factor of 4 since World War II, and the amount of areas competing in the globalized economy means that everyone everywhere is on their toes trying to survive, being potentially undercut by someone else. The whole world system's in a rat race to the bottom. Nations become aggressive as their societies fall apart and become desperate. This isn't new across history. You can actually look at a series of over a dozen metrics that you can use to predict crises like this that have occurred over history. The last examples being the French Revolution, the crisis of the 17th century, and the Black Death. All the metrics line up for today. This means that the chances are extremely high we see a crisis that breaks across the world system in the decades to come. In all the previous crises, we've seen wars between the great powers, whether the Napoleonic, 30 Years' War, and 100 Years' War. However, a couple things are also making the war more worrying in the years to come. I've covered these factors in my Wars of the 2020s and 30s video. The first is water wars. The world is getting drier due to global warming, and lots of areas with declining water systems at the same time as coming off an era of massive population growth. Nations are trying to grab water for geostrategic reasons, with Turkey damming up rivers flowing into Iraq, China, the rivers flowing that make up 20% of India's water supply, and similar problems in Central Asia. For a lot of countries involved, the water is necessary for their survival as nations. India, a nation with a restless and overpopulated farmer population, is already struggling with water as is, and is the area I'm most worried about. The third factor is aging, in which populations are collapsing around the world due to low birth rates. China, Germany, Japan, and Russia's populations are projected to halve over the next 70 years. The effects are worse of anywhere in Eastern Europe. Aging of this degree is unprecedented and will murder nations' economies as the elderly take up more money to support them, which leaves decreasing amounts of young with less and less. This creates a death spiral. The reason Russia and China are being so aggressive right now is to rage against the dying light before their societies fall apart due to aging. Finally, the balance of power and social systems that were created at the end of the Second World War, whether the American guarantorship of the world order, the US dollar hegemony, the managerial bureaucratic economic system, the technocratic social order, the United Nations, and in much of the Third World, the nation itself, cannot survive the pressures that a new world is putting upon them. We're seeing old orders fray and be crushed under the weight of the new world order. The best example of this is China's threatening of America as the dominant world power, which creates the condition called Thucydides' trap, where America is incentivized to crush China before China becomes more powerful than America. The historian Barbara Tuchman described the world before World War I as buzzing with chaotic energy that led to war due to industrialization being so destabilizing, and I think we see the same energy now, with the massive pain caused by the rise of the internet, which whips societies into a frenzy where stuff like canceling and mass hatred's okay. I think it's very telling how a majority of chattering class Americans support a US war over Ukraine since they've been so riled up by mob mentality. It's almost like the mass frenzy that took place before World War I. Industrial wars are so horrifying that countries don't fight them unless they're backed up against a wall. However, the situation we're seeing is that many countries are in that very situation. Countries are willing to gamble the chances of dying gloriously if they're afraid they're going to die anyway. When people ask me what the world would be like if World War I never happened, I reply that never could have happened. The world order was so fundamentally tilted towards war that if war didn't start with the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, it would have started somewhere else. In the decades leading up to World War I, you saw wars nearly break out over the islands off the coast of Germany, Morocco, the Congo, and a few other places. Every time the great powers were able to paper the problem over, but when the world order was that unstable, war had to happen at some point. The world's nowhere near as unstable as it was before World War I, thank God, but we have a similar crisis where we see lots of powder kegs connected around the world waiting for matches to drop on them. We've seen greater war nearly break out many times over the last 2 years, with flashpoints in North Korea, Taiwan, between India and China, over Iran, Turkey, and Ukraine. Every time the great powers have been able to paper things over. However, what happens if we have a major recession that crushes the standard of living or mass riots start breaking out in China? We've already seen the world drift into madness. We've lived through things that our parents in their youth would have viewed as science fiction. Mushy as it sounds, I remember Carl Jung describing the vibe in Europe before the First World War as a palpable frenzy of energy and fear that intoxicated the continent for years before war broke out. The continent got drunk before it fell into barbarism. I think I know that feeling since we're experiencing it today. Much as I painted a horrible and lurid picture of how we might be able to dance to our graves, I think a world war isn't the most likely option, at least not in the same way the world wars we experienced them in the 20th century were. The first major point to get across is that we're used to assuming total wars or epic struggles that are waged by entire nations with their whole energies are normal across history. Well, they're really not. We only have 2 eras of total wars across history: the early industrial era from the Napoleonic to World War II, and the 3rd century BC. For the rest of history, you had big wars, but I wouldn't call them total wars. Look at the 100 Years' War, 30 Years' Wars. These were horrible wars that killed millions of people, but they went on for decades with their countries functioning while World War I broke Europe in a 4-year period. The difference was that the military technology of the times meant that war wasn't all or nothing, and so the way you won wars was by trying to get the other side to go bankrupt by dragging out the war as long as possible and hurting their economy indirectly. Large set-piece battles were pretty rare in these wars, with skirmishes and sieges being the most common. The problem we run into with predicting the future of war is that everyone is always wrong. I'm not messing around. Often the smartest people in the world try to predict what will happen in the next war, only to be magnificently wrong. Humorously, I think the best strategy might actually be just to predict the opposite of what everyone else is doing to get it right. I'm kind of stuck between if the next war will be unimaginably horrifying due to advanced technology, or if technology is descaled war to make it less intensive. It's really impossible to know. The conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East make it look like war has become less intensive, but in both cases, it's militaries that aren't very effective. When we've seen the crack US Army fight in conflicts like Iraq, it's been able to blow conventional opponents out of the water with blitzkrieg precision. A couple factors determine the nature of the next war. The first is how aggressive and/or effective China is. Ukraine was really interesting to see on my part, since I had seen reports both saying the Russians had modernized their military and made it incredibly effective, and those that said their military would be terrible. It's interesting to see that the actual Russian military, as it fielded, undershot expectations. China is very similar, and then I've heard reports that the Chinese either will be extremely capable and aggressive in a conflict, or corrupt and disaffected. The Russian weakness in Ukraine, a conflict I expected the Russians to win in 2 weeks, is a load off one of my paranoid fantasies that the Russians and Chinese deal to coordinate a two-front war over Eurasia. With the Russians no longer being a viable threat to NATO and Europe, that leaves the Chinese alone in the East. In a scenario where the Chinese are a real threat, things get scary. China's 4 times America's population and the largest industrial output of any nation in the world. If they fight well, they'll be unstoppable. However, the other scenario is that China's not unified and isn't effective. In a world like this, China just collapses into civil war without waging an external war. I think this scenario is pretty likely and shouldn't be discounted. China just collapses into riots and rebellions as the government falls apart. If China falls to internal problems and doesn't reform as a powerful totalitarian state, there's no way we have a major war. The free world would have a series of internal social problems, but they're manageable. However, the Chinese are a proud people, and I partially have trouble imagining them go out quietly. There are 2 important mitigating variables that make a legitimate world war less likely. The first being nuclear weapons. Although I think a conventional war could still happen with countries having nuclear weapons, in the same way that poison gas was never used in World War II, I think even having them on the table makes world leaders think more carefully about starting major wars. This is a huge factor that needs to be emphasized, but it's really impossible to know how huge a factor it is. The second is that major wars normally happen when there's lots of young people. This is the case for the Napoleonic and World Wars. Most nations today have collapsing youth populations that make war very socially costly. Although I think a world war could easily happen, I don't think it's the most likely option due to these factors. When you're predicting the future, you're looking at different die roll chances. I think there's a small chance that nothing goes wrong at all. The old world order has been building up to release and it has to go somewhere. Likewise, I think the chances of an old-style World War II conflict are there, but they're in the minority. I think the most likely option is a conflict like the 30 Years' War. For those that don't know, the 30 Years' War was a conflict fought between basically every country in Europe from 1618 to 1648. This was caused by one of those social collapses I talked about earlier in the video, as practically every nation in Europe waged a war to keep their local social system intact, while also fighting a war with foreign powers. However, due to the underlying issues and stresses of the war, basically every country was fighting a civil war by the end of the conflict. The thing I find compelling at the 30 Years' War is that it's a model that allows a reset in the world system, while I think a world war model doesn't perfectly fit for the present. What seems more in keeping with the spirit of our times? The world wars were fought on the tails of large, earnest young populations mobilized by the recent Industrial Revolution, and I just don't see those factors being there today. In the 30 Years' War, nations fought through proxy by funding allies waging economic war with the others, trying to destroy other countries' societies, while nations themselves were torn by massive class, ideological, political, and social divisions, much like today. If we're using the 30 Years' War as a proxy for a future conflict, it would look like this. Again, the chances of anything you can think of imagining are pretty low, and the chances of something you can't even imagine happening are the highest. But this is a potential scenario that might not even be the most likely scenario, but I think it's a compelling vision for what could happen. Russia conquers Ukraine after a nasty 3-month conflict. China, realizing the time is soon, invades Taiwan while the world is busy looking at Europe. America doesn't directly want to start a conflict with China, so blockades China of oil and all trade through the Straits of Malacca. China cannot survive as a nation without ocean-bearing trade, and so the Chinese attacked U.S. allies like Vietnam and eventually India. The Chinese support a North Korean invasion of South Korea. The Chinese get assurances of a Russian invasion of Eastern Europe and NATO, which does not occur. Putin would like to see the Chinese and Americans fight each other to weakness. The conflict isn't a total war. It's a limited one with armies numbering in the millions, but no draft. The advantage lies with the infantry in this conflict, and the Chinese don't fight super effectively, so their armies get bogged down upon attacking their opponents. There are immense social pressures to draft, but all sides are worrying instituting a draft would result in revolts. Countries use social media to pump out lots of propaganda. The internet goes into a war frenzy, and normal people, probably including yourself, have been misled to believe that the war is totally justified and necessary. America doesn't technically declare war on China per se, but millions of Americans are fighting in Asia with American allies. The great powers have agreements not to use nukes in case there are no bombings on countries proper. Countries instead use cyber and economic attacks. The Chinese pull out of the dollar system, which results in a global collapse in standard of living. People hate the world and seethe, but governments use wartime laws to prevent dissent. An important factor is that we would see the breakdown of the global agricultural system. And we're seeing this today with a lot of analysts thinking we're going to have famine in much of the world by the end of this year. But the world's agricultural system is very intertwined, and so political problems result in mass famine and inability to move fertilizer around and starvation in food insecure countries, and this would just get remarkably terrible if we had a war or political disturbance. With the exception of the United Kingdom, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavia, most of Europe doesn't support America in this conflict. The US pulls troops out of Europe as punishment, and the financial crash hits Europe hard, with radical parties and revolts across the continent. Skirmishes start between Poland and Russia that escalate into a Russian invasion of Poland that fails as Russian soldiers refuse to fight. Russia falls into revolution and civil war. China falls into civil war as the war ends. The Treaty of Tokyo solidifies the borders of the New World Order. Far-right candidates are elected into power in India and the US, which cause left-wing urban revolts, which are countered by right-wing militias, finally with right-wing governments cracking down. The worst possible option is that these countries become military dictatorships. Across Eurasia, we see warlords rise to power as atrocities like genocide against ethnic minorities and conflicts that kill millions. We now end up with cascading effects. How do you predict the Vietnam or Korean wars from the death of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand? As conflict begets conflict over the decades, we start to see a new world order establish itself. Whether it's a new caliphate, a Chinese prophet who founds a new religion, and the people who have seen so much horror will start to have families again. People will forget all the big ideas they once believed and settle down for order. The biotech industry will usher in a new revolution as the next genre of music comes from the garages of Phoenix, Arizona. What If Altist is often called a doomer channel since I predict what will end, but what I can't show you is what will come. If I was in 1914, I could tell you that the age of emperors, traditional religion, and big finance would end, but I wouldn't be able to tell you how jazz, feminism, communism, the movie industry, and affordable cars were all around the corner. I've started feeling nostalgic for this moment in time. I've taken moments to think about how we're in the last moments of our age. I'm savoring drinking a latte while listening to DaBaby and scrolling through Tinder in the same way that I'm sure a nobleman in 1788 savored his beef bourguignon and Rousseau while looking at his big-wigged friends, concealing an inner chuckle that the world that everyone else around him believed to be immortal would pass away like clouds over the mountains. This all sounds pretty bad, and it might be, but I'm going to choose to be optimistic, and I look forward to being able to hopefully share this journey with all of you. I take joy in knowing that as this happens, we as a What If Altist community might be able to talk, think, and, God willing, possibly alter the events to come in our own little way. Let's get some popcorn. What If Altist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Alternately, check out my Pearl, Pillar, or Patreon. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.